Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the East-West Center. My name is Nicholas Hamisevicz, and I'm a program manager here in the East-West Center's Washington, D.C. office. We have a great event for you here today on the Indo-Pacific Lens on the Arctic, U.S. Partners on Arctic Security and Governance, featuring Dr. Elizabeth Wishnick, Senior Research Scientist in the China and Indo-Pacific Security Affairs Division at CNA, and an Adjunct Senior Research Scholar at Columbia University. We've had the pleasure of working with Dr. Wishnick through our Research, Innovation, and Collaboration Exchange Program, where we use the acronym RICE. The Research, Innovation, and Collaboration Exchange Program brings in scholars, policy experts, a variety of organizations, researchers, and journalists from the United States and the Indo-Pacific region to undertake innovative research or set up collaborative programs on important topics related to Indo-Pacific affairs. With her efforts in this RICE program, Dr. Wishnick brought together scholars and experts from the U.S. and Indo-Pacific, as well as Arctic researchers at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, to discuss in virtual seminars the United States' approach to the Arctic and Russia-China cooperation, as well as the perspectives of the respective Indo-Pacific partners of the U.S. who are part of the Arctic Council. Our sincerest thanks to so many of you for joining those events throughout the spring and summer of this year. We also want to thank the University of Alaska Fairbanks, particularly Dr. Troy Lefard and Dr. Cameron Carlson, for being such great partners on this project. We will have the papers featuring the Arctic policies and views on China-Russia cooperation from the perspectives of the US, India, Singapore, South Korea, and Japan, respectively, hopefully published next week. Now, after helping organize those events, working on the topics and papers, and doing her own research and analysis, Dr. Wishnick is going to present her findings on this Indo-Pacific lens of the Arctic. Her analysis will also be in written form, as well as one of our occasional paper series publications. This will hopefully be published at the end of the month, so please stay tuned for that release. But for today, Dr. Wishnick will present for about 20 minutes. We'll then have a guided discussion, and then open it up for your questions. Now let me properly introduce Dr. Wishnick, and then we can hear her presentation. Dr. Elizabeth Wishnick is a Senior Research Scientist in the China and Indo-Pacific Security Affairs Division at CNA, and an Adjunct Senior Research Scholar at Columbia University. Dr. Wishnick focuses on China's foreign policy, non-traditional security in Asia, and great power relations in Central Asia. She was also a professor of political science at Montclair State University from 2005 to this year. Dr. Wishnick has a forthcoming book entitled China's Risk, Energy, Water, Food, and Regional Security, so please be looking for that release as well. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Elizabeth Wishnick. Liz.
Thank you, Nicholas, and thank you, Zoe, for collaborating with me on this project throughout the year, and also great thanks to Troy Lefard and Cam Carlson out of the University of Alaska Fairbanks, who are my partners in this project. So this has been such an interesting study for me. My background is on China and Russia, and I came into this project thinking that the China-Russia partnership and growing concern about China's activities in the Arctic would be a mobilizing factor for the Arctic policies of U.S. Indo-Pacific partners, Japan, South Korea, India, and Singapore, all of whom are observer states in the Arctic Council, the governance body for the Arctic region, just as China is. In the course of this project, which involves 5 sets of virtual dialogues with U.S. Arctic scholars and Arctic scholars from these 4 countries, I found that their perspective is not as I had imagined, that the story is much more complicated. And so that's what I'm going to present to you today, is my conclusions from this project involving research and also interaction with Arctic scholars from the Indo-Pacific. And so it's been a fascinating research project, and I'm grateful to the East-West Center for funding it and enabling me to examine this issue, which it really hasn't gotten the attention that it deserves. So very luckily for me, last week, the Department of Defense issued its 2024 Arctic strategy, which outlined the U.S. government's view of Arctic geopolitics. And some of you probably have seen this strategy. And what's interesting about it is that it highlights China's growing activities and influence in the Arctic region, and also emphasizes the deepening China-Russia collaboration in the region. What it's not mentioned, though, is the role of U.S. Indo-Pacific partners in the Arctic. So the strategy mentions U.S. Arctic partners, all of which are now NATO members, since Sweden and Finland recently joined. Apart from Russia, all of the other members of the Arctic Council are now NATO members. And so we have seen a trend of NATO engaging more with Indo-Pacific states. The East-West Center just had a workshop on this very topic about the Indo-Pacific Four involving Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, and their interactions with NATO. But the Arctic doesn't really come up in these conversations, and of course Singapore and India were not involved in it. And so the question for my study is, how do these four U.S. partners in the Indo-Pacific, Japan, South Korea, India, and Singapore, view Arctic security and governance? And what I found is that while China looms large for all of them, for a lot of different reasons, it's actually Russia that plays the key role of gatekeeper to the Arctic for these four countries. And that's because of geography. We focus a lot on China in this region. And it's true that China has been increasing its activity since around the time that it joined the Arctic Council as an observer state in 2013. China tried to make a series of investments in Arctic European states, and those got a lot of attention. They received some blowback, and China had to pull back on many of them, and there are really very few existing today. And there's a scientific station to monitor the aurora borealis in Iceland. But most of the other projects are located in the Russian Arctic. And so China has not been as successful as it claimed in terms of its activities in the Arctic. It issued a white paper in 2018 calling itself a near Arctic state because of the impact that climate change in the Arctic has on China, and because of China's economic interests in the region. And that ruffled a lot of Arctic feathers because of the concern that China was an outsider trying to encroach on the region. And then at the same time, China and Russia were deepening their partnership. China was investing in Russian LNG projects, liquid natural gas projects in Yamal and in the Russian Arctic. And so there was a sense in the United States that there was a new geopolitical situation in the Arctic because of China's increasing activism, although that seems to have been stalled to some extent, but counterbalanced by the deepening China-Russia partnership, including in the Arctic. And we've also seen some military cooperation. Just recently, we had Chinese and Russian strategic bombers off the coast of Alaska. We had also seen Chinese ships in the region. A Chinese ship participated in an exercise off the Gulf of Finland. So China has been showing its presence in the Arctic region, and that causes concern for the U.S. because of our global focus. So now I want to show you some maps of the Arctic and to explain what I mean by the Indo-Pacific Lens and why it's important to see how different countries view the Arctic in different ways. So this is the way the US views the Arctic from above. So this is the circumpolar view. So the US Arctic presence is based on Alaska, which you see there in blue. And so when we approach the Arctic, we can do it in multi-directional ways. We can approach the Arctic from Alaska, and so that gives us that that circumpolar view, or we can go to the other side from the east coast, and then we have Greenland and Iceland and the European Arctic on the other side. So the US, because we're a bi-coastal nation, and we have an Arctic coast, we approach the Arctic from this perspective as a global actor. And so the geopolitics of the region is more apparent to us. What about China? So this is an interesting map. This was published by a Chinese research institute before China became an observer of the Arctic Council in 2013. So this is a vertical map. So China is in between the two poles in this map. So why this map? Because it justifies China being at the center and being important to both poles. So if you view the map this way, China is not there, right? Where is China? It's not on the map. If you look at the map this way, then it's the US that's marginalized and China is at the center. So if you're an Arctic hand, you might have read Anne Brady's book on China as a polar power, and that's on the cover of her book. Because it shows the way China tries to portray itself as essential to the discussion of polar issues. And for China, the Arctic is the only region of the world where it cannot operate independently. It also needs Russia because of the Arctic coastline passing above the Russian coast. And that rankles China a bit. And so part of its desire to participate is to have the ability to engage in that region just like it does elsewhere in the world. And what about other Indo-Pacific states? And so for India, for Japan, for South Korea, and for Singapore, the route to the Arctic is around Russia. So that coast above Russia is known as the Northern Sea Route. And the entire passage from the Russian coast to Britain, and you would see, I guess, Iceland in a different map, would be called the Northeast Passage. So the Northwest Passage is above the North American Arctic, and here you have the Northeast Passage with the Northern Sea Route being the part above the Russian coast. So for Indo-Pacific states, the road to the Arctic goes around Russia. So there's no escaping that fact of geography. And that's why Russia is so important to their Arctic ambitions. And then finally, India. So India does not want to go around China. India would like to go directly to the Arctic, and so it's interested in this new north-south route, or south-north route, depending on your direction, that would go from Mumbai to the Arctic coast of Russia. And so depending on where you are in the world, you have a different understanding of the Arctic and its challenges and how to engage with the region. So I'm going to keep this map here for us. So the Northern Sea Route is the gateway for Japan, South Korea, India, and Singapore. But sanctions on Russia since 2022 have impeded their access. And so that creates some dilemmas for all of us. And this is true even for Singapore, because Singapore had some involvement in the shipping aspect of the Northern Sea route. For the other three countries, they have very complex relationships with Russia. Japan, because of the Northern Territories, which they dispute with Russia. They've yet to sign a peace treaty ending World War II. South Korea, because of the Russia-North Korea deepening relationship that impacts their security. India, because of the China-Russia partnership and their concern about Russia's role in the potential conflict between India and China. And so their relationship with Russia is significant for other reasons, and they wanted to engage with Russia in the Arctic as a way to offset some other foreign policy concerns that they have. Oops. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, we have seen growing ties between the Indo-Pacific and NATO, the IP4, but we have not seen much discussion about the Arctic in this context. We've also seen greater interest by European countries in Indo-Pacific security and more attention by Indo-Pacific states in European security, especially the war in Ukraine. Interest, we've seen Japan and South Korea and Singapore observing the sanctions, some of them even imposing some of their own. India not observing the sanctions, in fact continuing to engage with Russia and actually increase its purchases of oil from Russia at this time. So what does this mean for the US in terms of engaging with Indo-Pacific states in the Arctic? I think it means that a geopolitical approach may not be the most successful one if the US wants to find common ground with Indo-Pacific partners in the Arctic. And that's because their perspective is different. And they have a variety of geopolitical concerns that may overlap with US concerns about China-Russia, but may not be the central ones for them. And so I would argue that a geoeconomic focus might make more sense, especially one that highlights non-traditional security as an area to engage in with these U.S. Indo-Pacific partners. So if we look at the Arctic policies of these four states, which I do in the paper that will be forthcoming soon, we see that they mostly emphasize these non-traditional security areas. So all four of them have been involved in Arctic science for some years. And this was surprising to me for a country like Singapore, for example, that is 6,000 miles from the Arctic, nonetheless feels that there are areas of science that concern Singapore, Arctic science. What kind of science? So Singapore is interested in climate science because as a country susceptible to sea level rise, what happens in the Arctic affects Singapore directly. India is concerned with black carbon and methane emissions. South Korea is involved in monitoring Arctic climate. Japan in looking at ice flows and ice research in the area. They're all involved in maritime governance. So Japan has been a proponent of an open Arctic, like the United States, where countries can participate and not have protected areas, as some do. Countries like Singapore and Korea have a vast shipping experience that they bring to this part of the world. India, as I mentioned, is interested in logistics and creating new corridors. The one I showed you, this north-south corridor, and also a corridor from Chennai to Vladivostok in eastern Russia that could then connect around to the Northern Sea route. And for India, these are corridors that rival what China calls its Polar Silk Road or its Ice Silk Road that it outlined in 2017 as a branch of the Belt and Road Initiative, the transit and trade corridor that Xi Jinping outlined in 2013 and 2014. They are all interested in Arctic energy in various ways. So fossil fuels, of course, the liquid natural gas, the LNG from the Russian Arctic, India, Japan, and South Korea are all interested in this. Japan has been invested in some of these projects. Also, green energy has been of interest, strategic minerals to produce green energy. And Singapore has some interesting ideas about remote energy, how remote communities can access energy. And that this comes from their experience in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, which is a fascinating way of connecting the Asian experience to the Arctic experience. Shipping and shipbuilding and port infrastructure are also areas where they have interests. So Japan studying how ice affects navigation, Korea involved in building ice-capable ships that can transport LNG, Korea and Singapore providing advice on port infrastructure. So Korea had a project to develop the Russian port of Murmansk in the Arctic, and Singapore had been advising Alaska, Iceland about port construction, and then India has an interest in logistics, trying to create these kinds of corridors. Space and satellites is another area where they've all been working. And they've been working independently on satellite systems, their own satellite systems. And satellite systems are important in the Arctic for navigation and also for remote sensing, for understanding the changes in the environment of the region, and so on. They've been working on international engagement multilaterally with a variety of Arctic states. They've been doing projects to reach out to young people in terms of education about the Arctic. Singapore has an initiative with Arctic indigenous communities, building on its own multi-ethnic status. And here we are in the Audubon Society building, so I can't not mention migratory birds. So birds from the Arctic migrate to the Indo-Pacific, to Japan, South Korea, India, and Singapore. In fact, they end up during the winter in a reserve in Singapore. And so that has created a lot of interest in studying these bird migration patterns. And India has an initiative about this to look at environmental connectivity in this way. So this is all a way to say that these countries, however distant they may be from the Arctic region, some more than others, have been focusing on it in many different ways. And I think the US, with its laser focus on strategic cooperation, as we see in this defense strategy, misses some of this picture and could benefit from some new pathways to engaging with these Indo-Pacific states in the Arctic. Because these four countries are reluctant, even though they have 3 out of 4, India being the exception, support sanctions on Russia, they still want to keep a door open to future cooperation with Russia in the Arctic because they see that as their only way into the region. And so it's up to the US to provide alternatives, even for India, which is trying to increase its partnership with Russia as a way of counterbalancing the deepening China-Russia partnership. I think the four states that I've been talking about are reluctant to securitize their role in the Arctic further than is necessary. And the Arctic region long has been associated with what has been called Arctic exceptionalism, the feeling that somehow this region could escape the nasty geopolitical conflicts of other regions. And of course, we've seen that that's not true, as Russian militarization of the region has proceeded, as NATO has expanded in response to the Russian war in Ukraine. We've seen that the Arctic can't escape geopolitics, but there can be pathways that try to examine other areas, such as these non-traditional areas that I've been discussing. And so there are a few prominent ones that I think are promising in terms of U.S. engagement with Indo-Pacific countries in the Arctic. One is to focus on their traditional areas of engagement, which is science and education. I think multilateral cooperation in science has always been fruitful in the Arctic, and even in the Cold War, we engaged with the Soviet Union in Arctic science. Now that's been disrupted, but our Indo-Pacific countries are eager to cooperate. Our Indo-Pacific partner countries are eager to cooperate with others on scientific research and to expand access to education about Arctic issues. And this came up in our dialogue with Indian scholars, where they were very interested in expanding educational exchanges on Arctic issues. And that's an area where I would say the Fulbright program might, very easily participate in to try to encourage more cross-regional educational collaboration on Arctic studies. However, I think probably two other key areas would be of even greater interest to U.S. policymakers, and one is technological cooperation, especially for communications and what's called in military speak domain awareness, or understanding of the characteristics of the region. And this, I think, would make a lot of sense because it could involve public-private partnerships, and it could involve the efforts that are already going on in these countries to develop their own technologies, satellite technologies, remote sensing, and undersea sensing, and so on. So these efforts are already going on an individual basis, and there might be an opportunity to collaborate, much in the way the U.S. is trying to collaborate with Canada, Finland, and Iceland in icebreaker production through the recent Ice Pact. And finally, training is another area. So the U.S. Coast Guard participates in training with other Indo-Pacific countries. There was just an initiative with Japan and the Philippines, and I could see some efforts moving forward in the North Pacific that would focus more specifically on Arctic issues, particular problems of oil spills in an Arctic, an Arctic environment, or issues with navigation and so on. Russia, for example, is training Indian maritime personnel in polar navigation, but that's something the U.S. could do as well, or Canada. So there are areas where countries are relying on Russia where they don't really need to, and we could be engaging more in these areas. So just to conclude here, I would say that the U.S., because of its circumpolar perspective, tends to take a global geopolitical view. But I would say our Indo-Pacific partners look at the Arctic from another angle, and we need to take that into account as we think of ways to engage with them in the Arctic. So I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Liz. That was great. A lot of great information there. Just to kind of start off our conversation, one of the hooks and interests that kind of started this was the Arctic Council, and how we have these 4 U.S. partners in the Arctic Council. And one of the interesting things that came up in our virtual and online seminars was that the observer status of these countries in the Arctic Council is a little bit, or the rules for observer status for these countries is a little bit different than other sort of multilateral organizations, and it seemed to be a little bit limiting. And so you have this sort of one approach with through the Arctic Council aspect for these 4 countries, but then you have a lot of the other aspects that you just talked about. And so can you kind of describe a little bit this sort of dynamic of approaching the Arctic Council for these countries versus those other sort of technological, scientific, commercial aspects that they're trying to do in the Arctic?
That's a great question. So the Arctic Council is the primary governance organization for the Arctic region. It covers all areas except military security, which is not supposed to be under the purview of this organization. And so we find NATO involved in the security aspects, leaving Russia out, of course. And so that complicates things because many of the security questions involve Russia, but we don't really have a way of engaging with them, institutionally on those issues. So within the Arctic Council, there are a variety of working groups on various topics. And those are indigenous issues, sustainable development, there's a bird migration initiative. I mean, there are all kinds of different groups. And observer states can participate in these working groups. And some of them are more active than others. But they can't take the initiative. It has to be Arctic states who are leading and the observer states that support. And so this was irksome to China. It doesn't like to be in a supporting role, likes to take a leading role. And it also constrains how much financial input can be placed because there's some limitations in that way also. But in the current situation, the Arctic Council is actually not functioning. Norway is the rotating chair, took over from Russia. But because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, activity stopped in the Arctic Council. Although it has resumed virtually and maybe in some working groups in person, or at least in the near future. But as an organization, it's not functioning the way it used to, and it's unclear what's going to happen. If Russia, how long is this war going to go on? What's going to happen with Russia's role in it? And so the observer states, they tried, before they even became observers, they tried to show that they were relevant to the functioning of this organization by engaging with different groups in the Arctic on these issues. So engaging with indigenous communities or engaging on sustainable development and so on. So or maritime governance. So all of these countries prepared well to make their case for joining. Some countries are not accepted, right? So these 4 countries plus China were accepted because of their legwork prior to the decision, and they all had to accept Arctic state sovereignty. So they had to accept certain principles of the way the region was governed. And then this is another thing that China didn't like, because it wanted to be at the table setting the rules. And the Arctic observers had to accept the rules as provided by the other states. So it's an interesting governance framework that's not really replicated in most other international organizations. So it provides opportunities for engagement, but also limitations.
Are there any other agreements, groupings for the Arctic that we should be paying attention to, or these countries are involved in that we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, so there's the UN organization, the International Maritime Organization, and that is a global organization, so we'll participate, and it is played a role in developing the polar code for navigation in the Arctic. Japan played an important role there. We have also the North Pacific Coast Guard Forum, which brings together the Coast Guards of North Pacific countries, so Japan and South Korea are involved there. There's the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement. So the Central Arctic Ocean is, according to this agreement, is protected for a period of years from unregulated fishing to try to maintain the fish stocks in that area. So that's an area that's generally ice covered and cannot be navigated for the present moment. And the idea is to protect that in advance. As the climate changes and ice melts, there might be opportunities in the future to navigate there, and the idea is to protect that environment. So, but that's South Korea and Japan are parties, but not the other states. Then you have the interesting arrangement with Norway on Svalbard Island in the north, where there was a treaty signed in 1920 to allow other countries to have research stations there. So just like in Antarctica, different countries have research stations. On Svalbard, different countries have their research facilities. So all of these countries have, except Singapore, have research stations there. And Russia, because it's now excluded from a lot of the Arctic Council's activities, is talking about creating a BRICS station there. And that's an area that's of interest to India, although it has its own station on this island. And so countries that work on Svalbard are supposed to play by the rules and only conduct scientific research, not engage in commercial activities, and so on. So China's gotten into a little bit of hot water about that because they have been accused of participating in commercial activities and also some dual-use activities, potential military applications. But that is an area where 3 out of 4 of our partners have been participants. And then there are a lot of more academic, think tank kind of organizations like the Arctic Circle Assembly that Iceland runs, which is an annual conference that brings together different countries and participants from different countries. And so you have networks of Arctic researchers from all over the world who come, including from Indo-Pacific countries. And there are a variety of other smaller conferences that happen in Canada, in Norway, and other places that bring Indo-Pacific participants. But the main governance organization remains the Arctic Council.
We talked a lot about the technological and scientific aspects of it, and then there's the kind of commercial aspect to it as well, where countries are looking at these sea lanes and being able to move shipping and other sort of goods. Where are those sort of dynamics lying? Are they more right now, and then can you see kind of, is it a possibility that commercial sort of outweighs those, or is more emphasized than those other sort of aspects of the policies and efforts into the Arctic by these countries?
And that's an interesting question, because I think there's, except for Singapore, I think Singapore is probably the most motivated by commercial factors. So Singapore was initially concerned that the Northern Sea Route would somehow take away business from Singapore, that everyone would be rushing to Arctic ports and poor Singapore would be left out. And so that was their impetus, and they also, so they're interested in exploring the shipping dimension from that point of view, from a commercial point of view. The other countries, it was more private-public partnership. So you had government initiatives in Korea, you had the 2050 Polar Vision, and in Japan you have the ocean policy, and then companies accompanied that effort. So Korean companies would be investing in Russia, building container ships for the LNG transit, and Japan, the Japanese government was encouraging companies to invest in Russia. in the Yamal project. And as we heard in the Japan dialogue, there may not have been a commercial reason for that. There was more of a political reason, because at the time Japan was trying to improve relations with Russia under the Abe government, and these investments were seen as a way of doing that, even though they proved to be difficult because of sanctions and other concerns. So I think that there's commercial activity, but there's a certain degree of government encouragement in many of the countries, with the possible exception of Singapore.
Well, another one of the big themes for these conversations that we've been having is the Russia-China cooperation aspect to it. And you talked a little bit about some of the military aspects of it, or the security aspects of it. Are there concerns that China and Russia, or one of the two, would do sort of the gray zone tactics that or sort of these dangerous security operations that are sort of hard to navigate, hard to defend against, hard to enforce against, hard to put into international law? Are we seeing any of that in the Arctic? And are there any similarities between what we see in the South China Sea and East China Sea to these sort of tactics yet?
Yes, we have seen that. So there is this new Chinese shipping line called the Hainan Nunu Shipping Company. That's a Hong Kong registered company that is now involved with Russia in creating two transit routes via the Northern Sea route. And this ship, one of these ships, the Nunu Polar Bear, last year was implicated in an incident with the Baltic Connector cables in the Gulf of Finland. And some in the region believe this was intentional, because the Baltics have been supporters of Ukraine. Others believe this was an accident. So the ship was dragging an anchor for a long time and cut these cables. So was that an accident? It's hard to know. They're still investigating this incident. Certainly some countries believe it was intentional. And we have seen this pattern of activity in the Taiwan Strait by Chinese ships and by Russian ships elsewhere. So that's certainly an issue. But if it was not intentional, there is the possibility of accidents in this region. And because of the difficult navigation conditions, there's a lot of concern about the potential impact of such kinds of accidents. But dual-use technologies are much in play in the Arctic, and a lot of these remote sensing technologies you can use for the environment, you can also use to detect submarines or have other military applications. And it's very hard to distinguish. So China also has gotten into some trouble for its dual-use technologies that are being developed on Svalbard, as I mentioned. So the potential for gray zone activity is high.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Let's open up to our audience and see if there's any questions that you might have for Liz as well.
Thank you very much for your talk. I wanted to ask a question about militarization in the Arctic. So, have you seen to what extent that militarization has taken place by China and Russia compared to perhaps other regions of the world? And what efforts are there that we can possibly take to limit militarization? So, for example, similar to the Outer Space Treaty, where we ban military activity in outer space, have there been similar treaties in the Arctic? And is this a plausible way forward for the U.S. to engage with Arctic partners through the lens of non-traditional security in order to kind of set norms and regulations around not using, at least if not, dual-use applications, then perhaps more overt military means in
That's a great question. So Russia and China are different in this way. So China has no Arctic coast. China is not an Arctic state. And so any military activity would have to be in partnership with another country, most likely Russia, because it's where it has a partnership. And so with respect to China, we've seen China developing technologies that might have military applications elsewhere. We've seen military exercises and patrols with Russia. And we've seen the dual-use technologies that I mentioned. But even though there's been talk of China developing ports in the Russian Arctic, we haven't seen any progress there, really. So the idea of a Chinese base on the Arctic is still far in the future and a speculation. Although China does have some port investments in Northern Europe that could potentially be used in some kind of contingency in the Arctic. It's Russia that is really the focus of concern about militarization. So Russia has the longest Arctic coastline, and it makes sense that it defends it because it is so extensive and remote, and also because 20% of the Russian GDP it comes from the Arctic, which is fossil fuels. But experts do see a trend towards militarization even in this context. And then you have the issue of NATO, and now the European Arctic is all involved in the NATO alliance. And so you have the necessary intrusion of this kind of geopolitics into the Arctic region. So now 7 out of 8 Arctic states in the Arctic Council are NATO members. So it would be difficult, I think, to ban military activity entirely from the region, because Russia would say it would need to protect its own shores, and the NATO countries have their own security concerns, especially given the Russian war in Ukraine. And so the out of area concerns are affecting the Arctic. So you have the Ukraine war in particular that is really alarmed the region, because it's directly impinges on the security of 2 Arctic states who have now joined NATO. So I don't know that you could have a treaty banning military activity. You could perhaps, like in the on the example of the Antarctic Treaty, where it prohibits military activity, you might be able to create a zone, like the Central Arctic Zone could be not just protected for fisheries, but there could be some prohibition of using that zone. But I think what the Arctic Council tries to do is to promote the idea of non-military interactions. And so you don't have a forum for discussing military security issues within that organization. That's a good thing on the one hand, because it creates a norm against the Arctic being an arena for military cooperation. But it's also a negative, because then you don't have a space where all 8 countries can discuss security issues. And so you might have, I've long thought that an organization like ASEAN has to engage with non-ASEAN countries. The ASEAN Regional Forum might be useful in the Arctic, so you can have an associated forum that would involve other countries that could discuss security issues. I think there are security concerns, and I don't think that by banning them you end them. I think there has to be some way of resolving them, like disputes over the continental shelf. Where should military planes and ships be able to travel? Just to have some more norm-setting ability or conflict resolution ability.
fuel, military ships and oil, as well as civilians, maritime, and merchantry ships and aircraft. Do you see China would take advantage of this one regarding to the Arctic, regarding to the Chinese naval capabilities in the region?
So this is why China needs Russia in the region, because Russia says that because of the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, Article 234, it has the right to regulate all of the northern sea route, the waterway above its coast. And so that means that Russian pilots have to be on ships, you need Russian icebreakers, and you need to pay fees, and so on. So China could have a lot of ships, but they still need Russian permission to be able to sail in that direction. They need to have the right technology to do that, and they are developing it. They need to have people who know how to navigate polar waters, and presumably they're learning that. They have a cooperation agreement between the Chinese Coast Guard and the Russian FSB, their Federal Security Service, to discuss maritime accidents and so on. So I think China has the enthusiasm to develop its Arctic fleet, but still is constrained by the need for Arctic know-how and Russia's permission. So that's one of the issues that bothers China, because it doesn't really have the freedom that its resources should allow it in this particular part of the world.
So my question is about the first is obviously that Alaska situated in between the US and Asia Pacific, and which is a part of the Arctic territory. So and in terms of the commercialization, the global shipping, the transportation, as well as the oil and gas, I think that Alaska has the very rich natural resource and such a position around the world. So I'm wondering about, from your observation, what's the role that Alaska play in this in the tension between the US and China, especially in terms of the military defense and so on. And second, the other question is about, from your talk that you mentioned about the involvement of Singapore, but as geographically, Singapore is situated in the country. So I'm wondering about all those countries whose territory is not close or part of the Arctic territory, then how do they join the alliance without the Arctic alliance and neighbor around the world?
Yeah, both great questions. So the last one, how did Singapore get into the Arctic Council? They were very well prepared because they made the case that they have a lot of experience in navigation, in shipping, and port construction, shipbuilding that would be useful to the region. So that the idea of applying to join is that you have to show that you're not just going to benefit, but that you're going to contribute. And so Singapore made that case very effectively, that it had a lot of experience that it could bring to the table. It was engaging with indigenous communities. It had the interest in the bird migration pathways, and it was developing also some interesting proposals about energy and how energy can be provided to remote communities in the Arctic, just as it had been in the Pacific. So I think even though Singapore is perhaps unlikely as a participant, it showed that it had relevance. And that was one of the very interesting parts of my project, is to find out about Singapore and all of its contributions, which don't get a lot of attention compared to China. We hear a lot about China and what's China doing. But other countries also have their contributions, and all of these 4 Indo-Pacific countries have made significant contributions to the Arctic. So Alaska, of course, is the U.S. Justification for being an Arctic state, and it's where the Indo-Pacific and the Arctic interests combine. And so we do see in Alaska, you see the Indo-Pacific Command of the U.S. military having training exercises there. That is where we have some participation by Indo-Pacific countries in various military trainings with the U.S. military. This is a state that is very independent-minded. It's it's very far from Washington and likes to stay that way. It has Senator Murkowski, who's a very strong advocate for her state. Has been involved in a lot of the Arctic discussions that go on internationally, and it has kind of unique perspective. On the one hand, it wants to develop resources. On the other hand, it wants to protect resources. And it's a remote place and low population level, concerned about potential influence by China, concerned about Russia, which is just across the way. You used to be able to walk, right, thousands of years ago. So there, it has a unique point of view on this. And so I think Alaska is very concerned about this competition, the geopolitics. The Northwest Passage is not the subject of the same scrutiny as the Northeast Passage because it's less navigable. And so you don't, even though China did scare a lot of people by creating a manual for navigation in the Northwest Passage some time ago, that's not very likely to happen, and there's been much less emphasis on that, shipping in that direction. It is an area where the geopolitics and the geoeconomics blend, and where a lot of interesting research is going on about this region, and that's how I got started on this project for my colleagues there in Alaska.
Well, thank you, Liz. As you can see from this interesting talk and all the insights here, you can see how we definitely enjoyed working with Dr. Wishnick and all the stuff that she's provided for us with her efforts for this RICE program. So please look out for those Asia-Pacific bulletin papers from the perspectives from those countries that are involved in the Arctic, and then for Dr. Wishnick's longer paper as well, all coming out this month. So please look out for those. But now, please join me in thanking Dr. Elizabeth Wishnick.